Module 7, long-term debt and capital appreciation bonds. For this week's module, we'll discuss long-term debt and its implications on local governments, in particular cities and counties in California. We'll then move on to our discussion on capital appreciation bonds and present some cases where capital appreciation bonds have been issued and their adverse implications for those cities. And then we'll look at the benefits and challenges of capital appreciation bonds. As we've seen, many organizations realize that they cannot afford to fund capital projects simply with cash on hand. The two sources of long-term financing are equity financing and long-term debt. Equity financing refers to money raised for the organization that does not have to be paid back, and is more common for profit organizations. Obviously, this is more popular, or the model that you would choose to do if possible. Long-term financing occurs when it becomes necessary to pay for capital assets when capital costs exceed the cash available from operations, or it would be prudent to use operating cash flow for capital purposes. So equity refers to additions to the permanent capital of an organization. Firms or for-profit organizations may rely upon equity financing for capital expenditure because it is much less risky. An example would be if a company chooses to sell shares of its stock to investors and use the revenue generated from the investor stock purchases to fund a capital project. In some cases, the company may wish to pay back their investors if a loss is incurred, but most of the time, the money made from those stock purchases are used for the project, whether or not a profit follows or not. Capital campaigns refer to fundraising drives aimed at raising money to pay for long-term assets. And long-term debt refers to the idea where borrowed money with a particular maturity or of a maturity date of more than 1 year. And short-term debt refers to borrowed money that must be repaid within 1 year. So long-term debt is debt that needs to be paid in more than 1 year, and short-term debt is money that needs to be repaid within 1 year. Leases are contracts to make fixed payments in return for the right to use a capital asset. Since government and nonprofits do not rely upon equity financing, we will focus on long-term debt. Long-term debt refers to money the organization borrows that will be repaid at some point in the future, and it is referred to as long-term debt because it will be paid again in longer than 1 year. So one way for governments to repay long-term debt is through bonds. And bonds are agreements to borrow and repay money with specific amounts and dates. The stated or face or maturity value is the amount that will be repaid at the end of the loan period. This is referred to as the maturation date. Bond agreements specify three primary things: the amount to be repaid, called the par, principal, stated face, or maturity value of the bond. 2, the rate of interest, which is referred to as the coupon rate, which will be paid on the face value of the bond. And 3, the time intervals at which the bond must be paid. Usually this occurs every 6 months. These factors are fixed for the life of the bond, so they do not change. So why do governments use or issue bonds? Governments issue bonds instead of borrowing money from a bank for three primary reasons. The first is risk. Banks prefer to lend smaller amounts of money to more people, whereas bond underwriters can lend large amounts and still remain profitable. The second reason is the aspect of disintermediate. Governments can save costs by issuing bonds from financial institutions or the bond underwriters that do not have an intermediary. Banks, for example, lend money to borrowers from the funds deposited by other individuals. In this case, the bank serves as an intermediary. And the third reason is to save taxes. If a state or a local government or even a nonprofit organization borrows money from a bank, it likely has to pay interest to the bank, and that may be taxable. Public service organizations may issue tax-exempt bonds. A tax-exempt bond is a bond whose interest is not taxable by the federal government and sometimes the state and local governments. These are referred to as municipal or muni bonds. Tax-exempt bonds save the issuer, the government organization, additional money. So this is very important because if you're not paying taxes on that bond that you're issuing, you're saving a great deal of money. So a great deal of discussion in recent years has centered on the topic of government bankruptcy or insolvency. This has occurred despite the fact that the number of municipal government bankruptcies significantly pales in comparison to the number of bankruptcies filed by firms or for-profit organizations. While the perception of the extent of local government bankruptcy may be greatly distorted, it remains an important topic in contemporary public budgeting and finance for several reasons. First, fiscal stress is commonplace across all levels of government and has greatly impaired the service delivery capabilities of many local governments. Even with the increased reliance upon information technology to improve administrative efficiency, delivering basic services have been compromised because of fiscal constraints. Some common examples are when municipalities shorten hours of operation or eliminate socially beneficial programs. Another reason why this topic is relevant is that the increase in defaults and bankruptcies has made the public more aware and interested in local government financial management practices. Finally, the seemingly abundant number of municipal defaults and bankruptcies provides an entertaining headline for the mass media and for public consumption. So let's take a look at government debt, in particular the factors most likely to lead a city or county to find itself in a position of fiscal imbalance. These are typically referred to or known as structural drivers and political facilitators of local government debt. Tax revenue loss. Tax revenue loss was seen prevalent during the early stages of the recession, primarily because of the boom or bust housing market and real estate cycles. Also factoring into this has been population shifts and decreased federal and state aid. At least three major reasons are important when considering the loss of revenue by jurisdictions. Some revenue loss is relatively temporary and comes with the boom and bust housing and commercial real estate cycles. Thus, the more high growth areas such as California, Florida, Texas, Nevada, and the Sun Belt are going to be affected by this factor more prominently. Long-term cycles of urban and rural decay as well as depopulation can also reduce property values and the overall tax base. The case of Detroit is a notable example. A third reason for revenue loss is the change of structural tax relations. California local government has been kept fairly lean and therefore more vulnerable in downturns since the passage of Proposition 13 in 1978, which undoubtedly kept local property tax revenues highly restricted. Additionally, a national trend has been the drop in state aid as well as federal grants. Fiscal imbalances. This refers to increased expenditures or decreased revenues. Many budgetary problems are the result of the mismatch of long-term revenue sources with the future stream of expenditures for existing levels of service. Yet some costs cyclically go up, just as many governments or local governments' ability to fund them declines. Excuse me. Service demands from high unemployment occur just as the tax base is retreating. The third predictor or structural driver is financial shocks. Small towns that have a large single employer that goes out of business or leaves the area are more susceptible to insolvency. And we've seen this occur in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, where they needed to retrofit the nuclear plants there, and in Vallejo, California, where the loss of the primary shipyard had an adverse impact on the community. Fourth is poor financial management. Sometimes the planning by those in charge is so poor that it puts the jurisdiction in jeopardy. The classic case is Orange County, California, in which the comptroller or treasurer, Robert Citron, was involved in derivative tradings that ultimately put the rich county $1.5 billion in debt. Although he served prison time for his incompetence, it did not stave off bankruptcy. So let's look at the political facilitators. The first, ineffective state government oversight. And we see the benefit of the state government oversight, or have seen that, with the local government commission in North Carolina. But many states obviously do not have such a structure in place. So while many states restrict access to bankruptcy court, they often do not proactively provide the oversight needed by ailing cities. Requiring balanced budgets does provide one means of decreasing the likelihood of excessive borrowing, but it is hardly sufficient. The lack of transparency and an unaware citizenry. Obviously, we can point locally to the city of Bell, but also if we look back at the Jefferson County, Alabama case, where there was a significant amount of no transparency. And the citizenry became aware, but it was much later in the process after they saw their utility bills skyrocket. So sometimes the citizens are unaware of the real implications of the policies and practices of their government. The example of the city of Bell, California, with its city manager and council extorting money from citizens through illegal means was a particularly flagrant case in point. And finally, fiscal policy incompetence. Fiscal policy incompetence need not be malicious or active, but the result of decades of program accretion beyond the local government's ability to fund. The city of New York came to its crisis in 1975 with 19 city hospitals and a full-fledged university system of its own. Another manifestation of the problem of policy incompetence arises when there is dysfunctional infighting and when special interest demands are impossible to control. And that's part of the reason why we saw the case in San Bernardino in the city filed for bankruptcy. So let's take a look at the capital facilities funding issues in California. First, there has been revenue shortages from an anemic economy, state budget deficits in a national economy resulted in fiscal stress for schools. And the California Constitution permits schools to incur bond indebtedness for real property. So historically, states and local governments have been reluctant to commit to long-term debt obligations that may result in interest payments amounting to 3, 4, or more times the original amount borrowed. At the same time, buyers are typically averse to locking into fixed returns because of yield, tax liabilities, and inflation uncertainty. Yet because both issuers and buyers of tax-exempt debt instruments are increasingly confronted with unique situations, state and local bond issuers have responded in non-traditional methods. So this is one of the reasons why there had been an increase in the issuance of capital appreciation bonds. So in 2013, Bloomberg Financial reported that nearly $20 billion in capital appreciation bonds were sold by California schools from 2000 through 2012. So we've talked about capital appreciation bonds, but let's look at the common type of bond that a municipal government will issue, which is referred to as a current interest bond. So municipal bond is defined as a debt security issued by a public agency, such as a state, city, or school district, to finance or refinance capital expenditures. Typically, the federal, state, and local governments allow the interest income on municipal bonds to be exempt from income taxes. In the period following 2008, many smaller municipalities and school districts have found it increasingly difficult to raise capital in light of falling real estate values and other factors that I previously mentioned. This is especially true as schools are limited in their revenue as a percentage of assessed value. Most municipal bonds pay interest on a semi-annual or even quarterly basis at the same rate over their entire life, and are issued from 10 to 30 years, with the entire bond issue redeemed at the maturity date. These standard bond instruments are called current interest bonds. A capital appreciation bond, on the other hand, is a municipal security in which the investment return on an initial principal amount is compounded at a stated rate until maturity, at which time the investor receives a single payment representing the face value of the bond and all accrued and compounded interest. So previously we looked at the impact that compounding interest will have in terms of your repayment, or even if you are the recipient of one of these type of bonds. And obviously it's beneficial if you're the recipient. So let's look at a comparison between current interest bonds and capital appreciation bonds. And here we see or at least 6 features and how they're different between current interest bonds and capital appreciation bonds. One of the main ones that you want to pay particular attention to is the cost ratio. Where in a current interest bond, the cost ratio is 2 or 2 to 5 to 1, which means that you would have to pay back double the amount that that's been issued, that you've been given by the financial institution. So if you take out a loan, for example, of $100,000, and over time you have to pay it back, you could probably expect to pay back $200,000, maybe $250,000 total. Whereas with a capital appreciation bond, the cost ratio can vary from anywhere from 4 to 1, which is significant, to more than 12 to 1. Another feature that distinguishes the capital appreciation and the current interest bonds is the term. So the term for current interest or municipal bonds are usually 10 to 25 years, whereas we've seen capital appreciation bonds extend to upwards of 40 years. That the debt service of principal is 8 to 10 or 10 to 12. So if we take $100 million of a capital appreciation bond financed over 40 years with compounded interest at a maturity at 10 to 1, then the total cost in this example would be $1 billion. So there are some cases in California that I want you to take a look at. The first is the West Contra Costa School District. In this case, they needed $2.5 million up front to secure a $25 million loan. The $2.5 million loan will ultimately cost the school district $34 million. In Fontana, the school district there issued a capital appreciation bond of $108 million. To ultimately retire the debt, Fontana will need to repay approximately $840 million over the next 40 years, or in the 40 years. And finally, in Poway, in San Diego County, the school district there issued a bond of $105 million, and the debt service for the bond will be nearly $1 billion, which represents a 9 to 1 ratio. And in this case, the bond will begin to be repaid in 2031. So, some of the things that one of the reasons why this occurs is because school districts get this large inflow of money and they don't have to pay it back, or the district and its residents don't have to pay it back for a number of years. But when they do have to pay it back, the cost is significant. So according to the San Diego County Treasurer and Tax Collector, the Poway case represents a perfect example of how something that's done today can adversely affect the next generation and the generation after that, and avoids inflationary increases for needed projects. And the immediate financing in recent years results in relatively low interest rates, so that's likely to increase as interest rates are ticking upwards, but in the past interest rates were at historical lows. So what are the disadvantages to CABs as they're referred to? Well, first, the payment is pushed back far into the future. Higher yields with maturity repayment increases debt costs. The size and structure of debt likely lead to default. The non-callable feature of most CABs constrains debt capacity, and this refers to the fact that you're not able to refinance the capital appreciation bond. So if your interest rate is 4.5 and all of a sudden the interest rates tend to go down, you're not permitted to refinance to a lower interest rate. And that's just how they're designed, most of them. The notion of intergenerational equity, here the CABs push financial burden from current voters to future taxpayers with less likely benefits. Maturities beyond 25 years mean that repayment is being made while useful life of a facility is slipping away. And we see that, we saw that last week in terms of planning for capital projects. The growth or assessed value projections become problematic, maybe even unrealistic. So in some cases, a city may say that we expect a significant population increase, and because of that population increase, we're in a better position to pay back this CAB down the road. And that's one of the reasons that Poway was moved towards this issuance of a capital appreciation bond. It's more of a affluent area, and they assume that 20 years from now, 30 years from now, that the property values would continue to increase and allow them to be in a better position to repay the bond. But that's not the case for most jurisdictions. Another issue is this: issuing a CAB may adversely affect other jurisdictions with overlapping debt financing needs. The risk that the only payoff strategy in a lot of cases, and this happened in Fontana, is to issue another capital appreciation bond. And then we have to look at the issue of accountability as a moral hazard. So board members and superintendents selling CABs seemingly for political expediency over fiscal prudence, they simply will not have to deal with the balloon payment several years down the road. They'll either be out of office, moved to another area, or have died on and moved on. So they're not necessarily worried about that as much. And the loss of public trust cannot be understated, as the public tends to become much more distrustful when information about the CAB becomes public information. So slide 14 shows there are some links there to look at some more examples of the capital appreciation bonds. Next week we'll begin our discussion on financial statement analysis, and this kind of gears us towards our project and how we understand the information in the comprehensive annual financial reports, and also how we begin to assess financial conditions.